Well, welcome to the Vicars Teapotcast. This is the second one that we've tried. If you haven't joined us before, then we'll introduce ourselves in a moment. But the idea of this is to give you a legitimate excuse to sit down with a cup of tea and to do very little apart from listen to us and hopefully have a bit of a chuckle as we go along. It's a very light touch sort of chat as we think about some of the issues facing us at the moment. As you can see, well, I'm definitely, you can see, wearing mine. I think if Josh lifts up his beard, he's wearing his as well. So we're looking at this from a bit of a churchy perspective, but hopefully something that's amusing, and indeed, hopefully today, something that might be helpful and a little bit thought-provoking to get you thinking today and in the days going ahead. To introduce myself, my name's the Reverend Chris Johnson, and I'm a vicar in Leicester. And Josh, do you want to say who you are?
Thank you. Yes, I'm Reverend Josh Young, and I am the rector of St Nicholas Church in Diocese of Rochester, so North Kent. And yes, thank you for that. As you say, we've been talking, as everyone has, about the current situation, because obviously it's affecting pretty much every aspect of our lives at the moment. And that's certainly true of church life, particularly how do we worship? How do we worship as individuals, and how do we worship together with our church buildings closed? Now, lots can be brought out of this, but the focus of today is looking at how we perceive and how we use what you call sacred space, which I found a very interesting idea. So, sacred space, what is it?
That's a good question. It can feel like quite a sort of a nebulous concept. I just wanted to use that word really. This sort of idea that can be really out there or can be really rooted. Probably the easiest description of a sacred space is a church, or at least a church building, one that we can gather in as the body of Christ, as the gathered community, and a place where perhaps over the years people have really had a sense of God's presence with them as they worship and as our hearts and our minds are lifted up in worship to God. But I think that sense of sacred space is something that's been with humanity since long before we were building buildings. If we look back into the Old Testament, when people have had an experience of God, these sort of great characters in the story have then built somewhere or left markers to remind themselves of God's presence with them as a way of encouragement and a way of memory as well. So that's sort of perhaps a really simple explanation. But actually, for others, the idea of sacred space might be even outside of a church building. Perhaps there's a place where you feel particularly able to pray or to meditate, if that's your way of accessing the divine and praying. Um, Maybe that's outside in an area of natural beauty. It might be somewhere that nobody else would really guess either, but for you, for various reasons, for the memories and the associations that you have with the place, it's very special to you. Um, as I said, it's not a new concept, sacred space, and even it's quite funny. There are some funny stories as well I've been discovering as I've been thinking about this teapot cast and also the current situation, because we're faced at the moment with not being able to get into the church buildings that many of us love and hold dear. And I know for myself that's actually been a real struggle. As a clergyman, I'm now allowed to go back in and to record and stream worship for the congregation, going in on my own or accompanied by my wife. And that's been a great help, and I hope that's been a help to the congregations here. We'll probably touch on that a little bit later on. But it's not the first time that the English people, at least, have been locked out of their churches. Apparently, I discovered the other day that going back to 1208, the Pope and King John fell out. King John wanted to appoint his choice of Archbishop of Canterbury. The chapter of Canterbury Cathedral said no, thank you very much. King John had a huff, the chapter had a huff and appealed to the Pope, and the Pope took his ball away and said, right, you're not using the churches at all. Sorry. Right. And that went on for about 6 years. So we're doing reasonably well. I think at least there are some plans coming into place for getting back within the year. So we're not going to be in quite the same situation. Interestingly, for history and law geeks, trial by jury seems to have been one of the things to come about as a result, with the clergy not being able to practice and work in the way that they normally would. Apparently, part of their job used to be legal proceedings and acting in judgment, even overseeing, I think, what we might know as a duel. So I'm quite glad that we were relieved of that duty early on, albeit 800-900 years ago. Um, but yeah, so one for the legal geeks to pursue there. Um, Another one I found, you might be guessing that I quite enjoy the whole idea of sacred space and may or may not have written an essay on it. Josh will remember that from college days. But when you get into the Civil War, the idea of sacred space sort of disappeared with the Puritans, because whilst worship was important, the church buildings much less so. They didn't have that same sort of sense of holiness and importance that we regained after the Commonwealth period. To the extent, I'm just going to check my notes, but during the Commonwealth period, so just after the Civil War, the Earl of Essex stabled his horses in Worcester Cathedral, and at Lichfield the soldiers who were stationed there hunted a cat with hounds around the cathedral each day to keep themselves occupied and presumably to keep the hounds exercised as well. So it's not a new phenomenon. Fortunately, I think we've taken a different approach to our forebears in how we've dealt with it. I should
There we
probably
go.
end the
Things to
history
do
lecture
during
here,
lockdown.
but sorry, Josh.
I was going to say things to do during lockdown. Hunt a cat around the church with hounds. I didn't know about that one. That's yeah, slightly different circumstances these days. Thank goodness.
Yes. Yeah.
But
So,
as you
I
were
mean,
saying, I mean, so this idea of being separated or even exiled from churches, this
mm,
isn't the first time,
no.
although it's been an awful long time in
Mm,
English history. But of course, around the world, this is not an unusual factor, even in this day and age. There are still people who are forced to worship in private through fear of governmental reprisal, persecution, even far worse. People put their lives on the line when they
mm,
worship God. Mercifully, circumstances are different for us here.
mm,
And yet, at the moment, we are in that rare situation, a highly unusual one, of not being able to meet together for worship. And as you say, for so many people, the sacred space that they would turn to is their church building. That is the place where they feel closest to God and find it easiest to speak to Him. I know we, amongst lots of other people, have been trying to find new ways of being a church whilst physically separated,
mm.
some of which have been working better than others.
So, what sort of things have you been doing to try and bridge the gap, so to speak?
I mean, some of it has been things very much like this, using the technology that we have
Hmm.
for to do services, either as videos on YouTube or live streaming via Zoom and Facebook and things along those lines.
Yeah.
And that's meant not only can people worship in their own homes, but their services can be broadcast in care homes and things along those
Mm.
lines. So I know a couple of which in my parish are now at a stage where the residents can come down to the lounge again if they so wish to. So
Okay.
there's a sense of smaller communities around that. That's something that seems to have been working.
I love the idea of them bumping countdown for you. I think that's a great thought.
I've been told unequivocally by the younger members that they watch Joe Wicks first and then me.
Oh, so that explains the beard. Okay, yes.
Sadly, not the physique.
Be careful, you might damage your arm. PE is dangerous. It's
But that's another way of kept sort of the school communities connected as well. Still doing collective worships,
hmm.
even though we're not actually collective physically, but knowing
Yeah,
that we are still meeting together, even if just for 5 minutes a day, to talk about something. And that also gives the kids in the schools the opportunity to send in questions, comments, to
hmm.
do readings videoed in their own gardens, things like that.
Fantastic.
That's been quite fun.
Yeah.
How about yourself?
A few bits are the same. I Well, yeah, I've ventured into YouTube as well, as we're discovering with the Teapotcast, but also recording the Eucharist. I'm going to do a video with my colleague about discussing this, so I won't go into too much detail just yet on that one. But it's been an interesting sort of exploration. I've done a couple so far, and it's really weird presiding not to a gathered congregation in the chairs, but to your laptop staring back at you as you sort of gaze at yourself on screen. It's a very strange experience
Mm.
to do that, but knowing that at least that worship can be shared by others, and I suspect there's a slight joy in some ways in seeing a part of the building again as well, through the streaming from church, because it's an important part of the church community's life together. So it's good for it to be seen, even though it can't be accessed.
And
Few
actually,
other
in a
bits,
lesser way,
yeah.
I agree that it's actually, yeah, in a lesser way, but lots of my church community have sent in some beautiful photos of the church and the grounds inside and out
Mm,
from years past, and we've been utilising those in the services, and you know, playing the hymns whilst those images are being shown and the prayers and things like that. So,
excellent. Yeah.
although it's not live, it's still a nice way of looking at that beautiful space that means so much to them.
Mm, that's good. Well, I suppose one of the questions we could sort of think about is what people can do at home. Obviously, there's been some good interaction with sort of internet-based stuff and recordings and so on. But perhaps encouraging people on their worship from home. There's a whole raft of resources out there, different parishes doing, as we've discovered, YouTube services or services via Zoom and streaming on Facebook and all sorts. But to encourage people perhaps to create their own sacred spaces as well, perhaps acknowledging that it'll never be quite the same, nor should it really try to be, but it doesn't mean that we don't have to try or are prevented from trying to make sure that we can pray at home or wherever we feel is most conducive. Um, I mean, I was thinking about some of the things that I've been doing, just some really simple things is trying, and I'm granted I've got the space to do it in my study, but I think even in a smaller home, one can sort of achieve that just by changing chairs. So perhaps don't make your praying chair your telly watching chair, for example, or if you're using online sort of streaming services and video conferencing for work, then you might want to have a space for that and a space for prayers as well, just to help to mark that space, perhaps within your own mind. And I think some people have commented they found that quite helpful for when they've been watching and joining in with the YouTube Eucharists and so on, is to have a sort of a separate chair and a place, and maybe somewhere where you can lay out a book, your Bible, your prayer book, or whatever. Um, in that respect, I think the thing I'd advise most with a prayer chair is to make sure it's comfy, because if you're not comfy, you're probably not going to get very far in the process of praying. So that's just something to bear in mind. How about you, Josh? What's been working for you?
Yeah, and I think lots of that sounds pretty similar. I received a letter recently, which was lovely, from a lady in my congregation who said she's now got a table which has got her iPad, Bible, and a candle, and referred to that sort of her modern day altar. And I really liked that as an image. That's a little bit tucked aside for worship, and
Hmm.
even in that small movement of going over there, it changes the focus,
Hmm.
and certainly the lighting of a candle, I think, can, well, it's something we do in collective worship. We do all the time. It's a
Hmm.
wonderful symbol of Christ's light being with us, even if no one else is.
Yeah.
And while the weather is beautiful, so looking out the window while we do it, but worshipping in the garden, I find is a real sacred space for me. I know you touched
Hmm.
on it earlier, but being able to just go and sit in a chair and listen to the birds while you pray, I find really conducive to getting that level of focus.
Yeah. No, well, it's all God's creation at the end of the day, isn't it? So I think.
And routine, I think, is one of the things that people are missing.
Hmm.
because obviously that Sunday worship is, yes, it's a key part of our Christian faith, but also it's a key part of the week for lots of people.
Mm.
And you can reason it out as much as you want, but I think most humans do like having a routine, and they feel a little confused and bereft when it breaks. I notice this very much in my 3-year-old daughter, who
Mm.
is far too young to really understand what's happening in the world, but does understand that she's not seeing her church family, and she's
Mhm.
missing them and missing that sense of normality. So something really useful and helpful for us has been creating a sort of a new routine.
Mhm.
So setting that time aside where it almost feels like church at home,
Mhm.
even if it's only for 10 minutes, just sing a couple of songs,
Mhm.
do a few dear gods, because that's what prayers are called.
Do you
And then
still get
obviously most
squash and
people
biscuits?
will get squash and biscuits, most important. That's what church is.
That sounds good. And are you finding some sort of messy and creative and crafty ways to continue to do church things at home?
Yeah, there are, as you say, there are lots of good resources out there.
Hmm.
Pinterest is just a wonderful thing.
Yes.
And yeah, throughout Holy Week and Easter, there were lots of wonderful images, and increasingly, and I think this is the interesting thing, they don't need to be overtly religious.
Hmm.
I think there's a wonderful sort of social and corporate aspect of this, in
Hmm.
the sense of putting shared symbols that people understand, things like the rainbows on the windows, or
Yeah.
a lit candle outside, or there's doves at the moment. Doves is a big one that people are making, and showing pictures of the doves that they're putting in their garden and stuff like that.
Oh, that's interesting. I missed
With,
it. Quite appropriate for us thinking with Pentecost coming up in a few days'
exactly.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, Pentecost approaching, so symbols of the spirit. That,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a wonderful aspect of almost worshipping together while you make it, but also then by displaying it, it's,
Hmm.
I think, in a very small way, a sign of witness for those who walk past and see it.
Hmm. And I suppose, I mean, we're recording this on a Thursday afternoon, and indeed, this is officially, I think, the last clap for carers at 8 o'clock tonight. So there's been that sort of shared community over the last, what, 10 weeks, hasn't there? I think as people have gathered together, albeit slightly dispersed around their streets, to gather together in a shared goal. And perhaps that's a good encouragement for us as Christians to make sure that, I mean, our shared goal ultimately is the worship of God and relationship with God. But perhaps that can be a good encouragement for us that even in sort of dispersal and isolation, that we can still gather together in our different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a link between acts of solidarity and acts of support and acts of worship. I know they are different, but there's connection between them, certainly.
Hmm. Yeah. I suspect we're probably coming towards the end of our cups of tea. Um, and if we're not, they're probably going a bit cold. I suppose to wrap up, I'm just going to hold that there casually, but just to sort of to wrap up is probably to encourage people, if they're regular worshippers, to keep going. If you're joining or sort of just peeping around the door of virtual church, to be brave and to have a go. And for everybody, whether you've been a Christian for 90 plus years or 90 plus seconds, to try something to make sure that you can keep your relationship with God going. And yeah, maybe use this unfortunately enforced break in proceedings to work out what it is that sustains you in faith. I think, how does that sound for a moral to pluck out from today?
I like that. I think good concluding words. This is an opportunity to try something new. There won't be a one size fits all answer, but I think it's a, as you say, a good enforced opportunity. If we can't do things as normal, then let's try something else and see what works for us.
Excellent. Right. Well, good to see you, Josh. Anyway, and always lovely to catch up. And I'm sure we'll see each other again, and we'll see if that beard is even more magnificent by the time we we regroup. Okay, well, good to see you, and thanks for joining us.
And you see you
Okay,
soon.
cheers. Goodbye.